Alrighty, welcome back to our series on American history. Today we're going to dive into the American Revolution, and I want to preface this by saying this is going to be fairly topical. We can do an entire series on just the American Revolution, but I want to kick things off and not get too into the weeds right off the bat. So, other than that, let's get into it. So this is the last slide that we ended on. The revolution is beginning. Colonial militias are practicing, they're drilling. The Minutemen see their first mention in American history. And the colonists are basically seeing the beginning of creating their own government. They're putting their own congresses together, and they also start raiding military depots for arms and ammo. And as you probably can guess, the British are not very well pleased. So, a nation divided. It wasn't everyone who wanted to go to war with Britain. As we alluded to in the last episode, there were a non-trivial amount of people who felt a very familial and brotherly bond with Britain. They felt indebted to them in that they protected them during the French and Indian War. So it wasn't everybody who wanted to go to war. And the people who were loyal to Britain were called loyalists or Tories. Tory was kind of like a derogatory term for them. Those who wanted to go to war and those people who were basically on the side of the people who were involved with the Boston Tea Party and Sam Adams, Sons of Liberty, that kind of thing. Those people were called patriots. Easy way to remember that is the football team and the Mel Gibson movie. What is happening here is it's important to keep in mind the perspective that everybody has. So when Americans think about this war, it's our war for independence, it's our revolution, that's how we started as a country. For the British, it's a civil war. These people who are rebelling are British citizens. It's a civil war for independence. And the other part of that is it's a civil war between the colonists themselves. These people are living together and, sometimes side by side, brother versus brother, the same way that you hear people talk about the Civil War. Those loyalists and patriots are all intermingling. They're all together. So keep that in mind as we move forward. It wasn't very cut and dry, the colonists versus the British. It was a lot more complicated than that. The shot heard around the world. 1775, we have some British troops moving to Lexington, Massachusetts. The Minutemen beat them there. There was about 70 of them, and they're lined up in military formation. They are looking for a fight. The British basically told them, get out of here, or we're going to open fire on you. And in the meantime, there was a shot. No one knows for sure who shot first, kind of like a Han Solo situation there. Personally, I think it was the colonists. I find it very hard to believe that some trained British soldiers just let one loose. I think the colonists were looking for a fight, and this was their excuse. But official sources don't have an official answer. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Personally, like I said, I think it was one of the colonists. After that first shot rings out, the British soldiers open fire. They kill 8 of the Minutemen. They wound another 10. and the rest of them basically scatter and hide and wait for the British to move on so they can go collect the dead and the wounded. So technically, first battle of the Revolution, the colonists get pretty smoked. The British keep moving. They move on to Concord, Massachusetts. This colonial force that they meet in Concord is significantly stronger. It's about 400 men, and they force the British to retreat. So very early on, within a very short period of time, we have the first battle overall, loss for the colonists. The second battle in Concord is a win. That's the first win we see for the colonists, and they force the British to retreat. While retreating, there were other colonists, a lot of farmers and militia members, who are firing at the British from the tree line as they're retreating. This is going to be the first time we see what is going to be a standard. The colonists are not going to play by the rules. They are going to engage in what at the time was called ungentlemanly warfare. What we would call it today is guerrilla-style warfare. They know that they're outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched, and they cannot win a head-on war, so they're going to use guerrilla tactics. At Concord, the British lose 99 men with 174 wounded. Colonists have 49 casualties and 46 wounded. I have here linked, I'll link it in the description as well. It's a video on Sam Whitmore by the Fat Electrician. It's fantastic. It goes into a little bit of a vignette about a particular angry old man during the Revolution. It's definitely worth a watch. I love the Fat Electrician. He's a lot of the inspiration for this channel, so please go check him out. Now, what's going on? We have the Second Continental Congress. They are meeting, and we also have the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonists adopt a united militia army. We talked about the colonies coming together before. Now it's official. And they vote on who is going to lead them, and they get a guy named George Washington. He is the new general of the Continental Army. Quick background on George Washington. He's been a military man for a long time. He fought in the French and Indian War on behalf of the British. And his successes were up and down then, but he has far more experience than most anybody else in the colonies at this time, and he is genuinely a good pick. The first time he sees combat as general of the new Continental Army is the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is where, if you've ever heard the quote, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," this is where that comes from. The colonists were, quite frankly, poorly trained in terms of military fighting. A lot of them had, experience with firearms, but not shooting at other human beings. So as a way to force increased accuracy, they were told not to fire until you see the whites of their eyes, basically bringing the enemy as close as you can before firing and increasing the odds that you'll get a good hit. They defend the fort at Bunker Hill and inflict over 1,000 casualties on the British, and this was a big deal. This wasn't just 400 colonists forcing an unprepared group of British soldiers to retreat like in Concord. The British came knowing there was going to be a fight. They came prepared, and they underestimated the colonists. It showed the British that this is not going to be easy. They're not going to be walked over. They're going to have to genuinely try. This is not going to be a walk in the park here. And more importantly, this shows the rest of the colonies that this isn't some pipe dream. They can, in fact, take on the largest empire in the world. They just need to be prepared. And this shows everybody that, a victory is possible. A genuine victory is possible. So we're going to declare independence. How does this go? Why does it happen now? What's going on? So the fighting happens, and like I said, not everybody wanted this war with Britain, and there were a lot of people that wanted peace. The French and Indian War hadn't ended that long ago. There's been a lot of civil unrest in the past couple of years. A lot of people just want to be done. They're sick of the conflict. However, by 76, Britain wasn't budging. They were very upset, and there was no compromise to be had when talking with the colonists. So they come to the realization, basically, that even if the fighting stopped right now and they said, Mr. King George, I'm so sorry, they're not exactly going to be welcomed back with open arms. Independence is the only option, and we are going to have to fight for it. So, July 4th, 1776, a committee submitted a document drafted by Thomas Jefferson, basically explaining why it was time to secede. And that's really all the Declaration of Independence is. It's a list of grievances, basically, and it's just telling Britain why the colonists are seceding. And this officially makes the 13 colonies of the United States of America. And we will see who is first to recognize us as a nation and how that goes moving forward. So I kind of alluded to this earlier. We are looking at a new kind of warfare. We know the colonists, the Americans now, the Americans know that they cannot take the Brits head on. There is no way they can fight a traditional war and come out on top. They need to find a way to fight an asymmetrical war. So, especially the militias did not play by the rules. The regular Continental Army was a little bit more regulated. They did fight a little more traditionally, but even they did engage in guerrilla warfare as well. The state militias are most well known for it. And it's basically, if you know anything about the way that the NVA and the Viet Cong operated during Vietnam fighting the Americans, that's very similar to what happened here. It's full of ambushes and sabotages and raids, hit and run tactics. These colonists are going to target officers. That is a huge deal at this point in history. The proper way to fight a war was to target soldiers, not officers. Officers didn't die in battle at this time unless it was a mistake. And without a chain of command, regular soldiers fall apart pretty fast. So with the colonists targeting those in charge, it really pisses off the Brits and also kind of destroys any semblance of organization that the Brits have on the battlefield. They're gonna use that to their advantage big time. Why? We kind of already talked about it. The Americans are outmatched on every level in terms of technology, the number of guns, the number of people, everything. They're just outmatched all over the place. They can't do it head on. So this is kind of one of the first times we see what today we would call an insurgency. They're not going to play by the rules, and they're going to engage in asymmetrical warfare. I have a couple of examples down at the bottom, but this is the traditional way to fight a non-traditional war. This is the way that we see smaller, outgunned, technologically inferior forces fight and take on and sometimes win against much larger, much technologically improved forces. So Vietnam I already talked about. Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, a lot of those movements in the Middle East over the past 30 years. I mean, how long were we in Afghanistan? Kind of the same idea. A lot of Latin American revolutions are going to do the same thing. We'll talk about that later in our series. And another one that doesn't really get talked about a lot is the IRA in the fight for Irish independence. They used a lot of guerrilla sabotage tactics as well. Britain's got a lot of problems. The British at this time, this is arguably the largest that the British Empire was. And taking a step back for a second, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, truthfully was one of the first world wars ever, simply because both France and Britain's empires spanned so far, and the fighting between both sides was rampant regardless of where you were. I mean, in our context, we talked about the American colonies, mostly the Northeast, but there were a lot of colonies in Africa and the Caribbean and the Orient that were right next to each other, one being French, one being British owned, and they did a lot of fighting too. A lot of the supplies came from all over the world. That being said, the British are not united. Just like there were people who wanted peace on the American side, there were plenty of people who did not want a war in Britain as well. Mostly businessmen. But you got to understand, like, these guys make their living trading with the colonies. Of course they don't want to be at war with the colonies. That means they can't trade. That means they can't make any money. There were some politicians that felt the same way, but it definitely wasn't a majority. What a lot of people in the government were worried about is that number would change over time. The longer the war dragged on, the more people in Parliament and the government would shift sides to not supporting this war. Britain really doesn't have the money to do this right now. Remember, the whole reason this war is even happening is because Britain is trying, or was trying, to recoup losses from the French and Indian War, and now they're at war again without having recouped those losses. On the other side, problems that don't have to do with the Americans, there are other colonial empires that are going to see the fact that Britain is having a civil war, and they're going to take advantage of it. They're going to exploit that. So, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, they are going to try to move in on a lot of colonial areas that the British had been traditionally in charge of. And that means that the British have to then send soldiers to make sure that doesn't happen. Well, all of their soldiers are in the newly formed United States. This means they're going to be spread out. They have less numbers. It's going to cost more money. Basically, what all of this means is the British need to win fast, because they are hemorrhaging money this whole time. They have to win quick. They have to win fast so they can stop losing frickin' money. What does this mean on the other side? That the colonists are fighting a war of attrition. The colonists don't actually have to win. They just have to last long enough that Britain runs out of that money. The colonists are very much aware of Britain's lack of unity at home, and they're going to use that. They're going to use the idea that Britain is leaking money like a sieve. So all of that comes down to a General Howe, if you're familiar with him. He is definitely worth a deep dive later on. But he invites the Americans to a peace conference, again, trying to get this war over as quickly as possible. And he says, come to this peace conference, we'll negotiate. If you guys come and, you lay down your weapons, you re-swear your loyalty to the king, you'll be good. We will pardon you. Don't even worry about it. Just let's get this over with. Let's stop the fighting, and you guys can be British citizens again. Turns out This was a lie. Howe had no authority to make any deal like this, and this pisses the colonists off quite a bit. They are going to refuse any further peace talks, and they're going to be very, very paranoid about any treaties or negotiations with Britain going further. So thank you, General Howe, for the lie and the paranoia. We appreciate you. So, having been basically flipped the bird by the colonists, General Howe, he wants to take New York City. New York City is in a very strategic spot in that if they take New York City, it will essentially separate the Northeast colonies, the New England colonies, from the rest of the colonies. Not only does that really suck for American morale, having been split basically into two fronts, it also makes getting supplies to both halves much harder for the colonists. And he sacks New York, and he's going to use it as his base of operations, or for Britain's base of operations, I should say, for the remainder of the conflict overall. And if we're looking at trying to take really big cities and really crush colonial morale, the next really important one after New York is Philadelphia. That's where the Continental Congress has been meeting. It has a lot of historical and importance to Americans, like it does today for a lot of the reasons we're about to talk about. But even then, it was a very important. The idea of brotherly love, that's not just a saying. That came from there. That's where Benjamin Franklin was from. It was seen as a very important city even back then. So the British are making their way there, and it's winter. So at this time in history, especially in places that have snow, wars basically just got put on hold. You just stopped fighting because it's really, really hard to fight in the snow, and it's really hard to find food in the snow, and everything is just harder. So in general, the gentlemanly thing to do is to dig in and wait for it to not be so friggin' cold anymore. So they make it to New Jersey, they dig in their winter camps, and basically they're just waiting. If we knew anything about the colonists, we don't play by the rules. These are, we're making everything up as we go. So the Brits are stuck in New Jersey. It's wintertime. It's December 25th. It's Christmas, 1776. And George Washington says, we're going to go kill those guys in their sleep. So he takes almost 2,500 men across the Delaware River at night for a sneak attack against the dug-in British forces. Their tracks get covered, their voyage gets covered by a blizzard, and they kill or capture over 1,000 British soldiers in this surprise attack. And they don't stop there. There are several more small battles and skirmishes in this area, and they keep the momentum going. The colonists, very early on, fight very well in the winter. They end up scattering, 3 more British regiments. They're riding this high. They're feeling really good. However, that momentum gets stopped pretty hard. Philadelphia falls to General Howe. Basically, he wanted to keep, that sacking New York really sucked for American morale, and he just wants to keep that going. He genuinely believes that if he sacks Philadelphia, it will, cripple the rebellion. They will lose morale, while at the same time it will boost morale among loyalists. And he thinks that if he takes Philadelphia, there will be a loyalist uprising, and he will have this new, fresh access to soldiers that have not been beaten down by this winter or this war yet, and he'll have access to all these new troops. However, there was no uprising. They did take Philadelphia. They did sack Philadelphia, but the Continental Congress escapes, and there is no loyalist uprising. At this point, the colonists are like, okay, yeah, fighting in the wintertime really does suck, so we're going to be done for now. They set up their winter camp at Valley Forge, and the winter hits them exceptionally hard. They are not prepared for it. They don't have the supplies or the food or the money to stay dug in this whole time. And weather and food shortages alone kill almost 2,500 men. A lot more. Runaway is a harsh term, but a lot of them went home. This is where you get the term summer soldier. Summer soldiers are around during the summertime when it's really easy going, and they kind of disappear during the winter when it gets hard. Insert Captain America joke here. So the Spanish. This is a very rarely talked about part of the American Revolution. Everybody usually attributes the American victory to France, which is not untrue. However, I think the Spanish involvement kind of gets swept under the rug a lot, so we're going to talk about it. These Americans, like we said, they're starving at Valley Forge. They need rations, they need food, they need reinforcements. So, a group of vaqueros, or cowboys, and a bunch of soldiers are led by a guy named General Galvez. And he takes cattle from West Texas. It was called Behar at the time. They do a cattle drive from West Texas through hostile Indian territory all the way across the southern United States to the East Coast, and then up the coast all the way to Valley Forge. They drive this cattle all that way. And as if that weren't impressive enough, all of the British forts that General Galvez's men meet along the way get decimated. General Galvez and his men destroy the British on this cattle drive. Thoroughly impressive. This is a very rarely talked about topic, and it is so beyond important because it is this cattle drive and General Galvez's men that save what is left of the Continental Army. It is the cattle that get there and the supplies they bring with them that save these men from dying of exposure and starvation. Without this, the American Revolution and today's geopolitical everything could be entirely different. So, big thanks to General Galvez. Now, we're going to skip over some time, and we're going to talk about the Battle of Saratoga. So, there is a Native American Indian tribe called the Iroquois. They are allied with the British. Basically, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They hate that the Americans are settling on their land, and they think if they ally with the British, they'll be able to push the Americans off the land. So the British begin moving south from New York City. Again, remember, this is where their base of operations was. And retreating American troops start felling trees in front of the British. Basically, they're going to start sabotaging the land that the British are going to have to walk through to chase them. So they fell trees, they burn crops, they remove livestock. They do basically everything they can to starve out the British, removing anything that they would be able to use to live off the land. While that's happening, while the Continental Army is retreating, militia forces are basically going around the British troops in order to set up an ambush. And they get behind the British troops and push them into where the Continental Army was. So it's kind of like a pincer movement. The British retreat back to Saratoga, and the Americans surround them there. Over 5,000 British soldiers were taken prisoner here. And this is incredibly embarrassing for General Howe. He is forced to resign here, and that is what we see in this picture is General Howe giving up his sword to the Continental Army here. So, big deal. This was a massive, massive victory for the Americans and showed how well that both the militias and the regular army can work together to really, really mess up the Brits. It was a turning point. So, at this time, the colonists, the Americans, had been getting some supplies shipped from France and Spain. Kind of like the beginning of World War II, where the United States is like, oh, we're not going to send troops, but we'll send you, supplies and stuff, lend-lease, that kind of deal. That's what's happening, but in reverse for the Americans from France and Spain. And the Americans really, really are looking for a commitment of troops. Despite how well the militia and the Continental Army are working together, neither of them are very large. A lot of people died at Valley Forge, so we need some fresh troops, and ones that are trained well wouldn't hurt either. The victory at Saratoga convinces the French to enter the war on the side of the United States. So, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but France is one of the first nations to recognize the United States as an independent country. So this is a huge deal, and with that, they signed an alliance, and France did commit ground troops to this war, and this is going to change. This is going to change everything. Oh, I'm sorry for this super blurry picture. I apologize. It looked better on my end before. Anyways. Native Americans in the war, they played a fairly large role, and again, if you guys want to know more about this, we can do a deep dive into their role in the war later, but we're going to keep it fairly topical here. That said, a lot of the fighting that the Native Americans did took place in the West. A lot of the fighting that's happening between the regular British Army and the regular Continental Army is fairly close to the coast. The fighting on behalf of the Indians is much, much further inland. A lot of the tribes included are Iroquois, Shawnee, Cherokee. There are several more, but those are the most well-known ones. That said, the British kind of just used them as cannon fodder. They weren't really a match for certainly the regular army and definitely not the state militias. And Native American Indian populations were decimated by basically siding with the British and the British sending them in basically to soak up bullets, unfortunately. Quick note here before we move forward. The term Indian, a lot of people really don't like because there's this myth that when Christopher Columbus got to the Americas, he thought he was in India, so he called the native people Indians. That's not true. That's not what happened. He did not think he was in India, and he did call the Native Americans Indians, or what Indian would translate to in his language, because it comes from Spanish. He called them the people of God, or indios. That is where the term Indian comes from. So do your best to keep that in mind, and the term Indian is actually not derogatory. It says you are the people of God. He had a lot of respect for the Native American people. He doesn't really deserve the legacy that he's given. Unfortunately, he was one of the first people, one of the first Europeans to make it to the New World and set the path for a lot of other people who came over here and then did really bad things. but it really wasn't Christopher Columbus. Anyways, that rant over. Moving on. War at sea. So, the British, as you may very well know, have, at the time, the largest, most advanced navy in the world. The colonists, as you can imagine, did not. So, basically, we're going to play the same tactics that the United States is using on land. We're going to apply that to the sea as well. Basically, this is naval guerrilla warfare, baby. So, essentially, the United States allows non-military people to attack British non-military ships. So, at this time, the British Navy isn't entirely self-sufficient, meaning that it's not British Navy ships that are resupplying the British Navy. A lot of time, it's private merchants who are being paid on behalf of the British government to resupply the British Navy. The United States issues these things called letters of marque, and it's basically a license for privateers to go and attack British merchant ships. If privateers could go and attack and sink or sack these merchant ships, that means that the British Navy is not getting resupplied. So this is going to be massive. By the end of the war, so much of Britain's cargo is seized by American privateers that it pushes Britain into a recession. It ruins their economy. So many of these things get taken. I have a note here at the bottom for John Paul Jones. I was going to talk about John Paul Jones and what a badass he is, but actually just a couple of weeks ago, the Fat Electrician did a video on John Paul Jones, and it's fantastic, so I will link to that in the description as well. But just know John Paul Jones was a badass. He did a lot of really cool things. Fat Electrician's video is really good, so check that out if you want to do a little deep dive into another individual during this time period. War in the South. Basically, everything we've talked about so far has been happening up north. And the South doesn't get really talked about a lot, though the Carolinas is where the Patriot is set. Anyways, early on, the British have a couple of pretty fairly large victories in the South. However, like the memes say, the people in Appalachia are a different breed. They go way too far when they try to subdue those people. The British get smoked by the people in Appalachia. Whatever guerrilla tactics that the militias were using, the people in Appalachia are doing that on a scale of 10. They are just ruthless towards the British, and they mess them up pretty good. A lot of the other militias are going to learn from these people. At the time they called them mountain men. They're going to learn these super aggressive guerrilla tactics, and they're going to use those to drive the British out of the South. And soon, the British are only going to have strongholds in a couple of the big cities that are left. So it's going to be Savannah in Georgia, and then Charlestown and Wilmington. So you can see this on the map, those little red stars there. There's not one for Savannah for some reason. But there should be. Just know that the people in Appalachia, the mountain men as they were called, they should be credited with more and should be talked about more, kind of in the same vein as the Spanish cattle drive. It doesn't really get talked about a lot, but I think it's a big deal. Yorktown. This is the one that most people have heard about. British General Cornwallis, another pretty famous dude, could have his own episode. He and his men, they march on Virginia. They are again trying to cut the South off from the Northeast, from New England and New York, and he very quickly finds himself outnumbered. He is doing his best to retreat to Yorktown, which is right on the coast. He is trying, he's doing like a little a Dunkirk move, if you're familiar. He's trying to get to the coast to then have his men get picked up by the Royal Navy. However, what he does not know is that there is a very large detachment of French troops on their way to Virginia on warships. So what happens when Cornwallis and his men get to Yorktown, they are surrounded on land by American troops, and then the French surround them by sea, and they are stuck there. It's a siege for a couple days. It's like 3 days of shelling, just constant cannon fire from both the Americans on land and the French warships. And after 3 days of shelling and being starved out and having their supply lines cut off, 8,000 British troops surrender and are marched out of Yorktown. It is this defeat, it is the Battle of Yorktown, it is Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown that convinces Parliament to basically start to sit down at the negotiating table. They need to begin peace talks here. The Treaty of Paris. There's a whole pile of treaties of Paris but the first one for American history is signed in 1783, despite most of the fighting being done by 1781. In this period of time, remember, it takes a long time for word to travel. The peace talks also took a very long time to get ironed out. But the conditions, as finalized in 1783, were here on the screen. I'll read them to you. Britain is going to be forced to recognize the United States as an independent nation. That is huge. The largest empire in the world has to now acknowledge that not only were they beat by a bunch of farmers and the French and Spanish, but now they have to recognize their former colonies as an independent nation. For all of their effort and their cattle drive and everything, Florida is given back to Spain. That was traditionally Spanish territory. Then the British took it over before the war happened. And anything that was any colonies that were seized in the Caribbean and Africa from France, both during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and the American Revolution, anything that was seized by Britain from France has to be given back. So basically, everybody goes back to the way it was before the French and Indian War, and then Britain also recognizes the U.S. as an independent nation. And that is kind of where we're going to stop for today. Like I said in the beginning, very broad strokes. I know we didn't talk about everything. I know there was a lot of stuff we didn't go over. If you want to hear about that stuff, let me know. And again, this is only our second or third video. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know how you like the format. Hit me up in the comments. I'll do my best to answer anybody and everybody that I can. And thanks for coming. I'll catch you next time.